My name is Emily Carter, and when I found out I was pregnant, I truly believed my life was finally coming together. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years. Not perfect years, but honest ones, or at least that's what I believed then. We met in our late 20s, both working, both tired of games, both wanting stability more than excitement. Daniel was steady, thoughtful, and deeply attached to his family. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. I thought a man who loved his parents would know how to love his wife. Linda, my mother-in-law, was polite to me from the beginning, but polite in a way that always felt rehearsed. She smiled often, but her eyes never softened. She asked questions that felt more like inspections, and compliments that always carried a pause, as if she were measuring whether I deserved them. Still, I told myself that not all warmth comes easily, and I worked hard to earn her approval. When Daniel and I decided to start trying for a baby, it felt like the natural next step. We talked about it late at night, whispering plans about nursery colors, names we liked, the kind of parents we wanted to be. When the test finally turned positive, I cried so hard I had to sit on the bathroom floor just to breathe through it. Daniel hugged me, his hands shaking, his face pressed into my hair, telling me everything was going to change in the best way. For a few weeks, it really did feel that way. We announced the pregnancy at a small family dinner. Linda smiled wide and hugged me, her arms stiff but proper. Robert nodded approvingly. Melissa clapped and laughed. Everyone said the right words. Everyone played their part. I remember thinking that maybe I had been wrong about Linda, that motherhood would soften her toward me, that this baby would finally make me feel like I truly belonged. The first comment came 2 weeks later. It was small enough that I almost missed it. We were sitting in Linda's kitchen, and she asked how far along I was again. I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was just confused. She didn't laugh back. She simply nodded and changed the subject. After that, the comments didn't stop. They just became quieter. Linda started asking Daniel questions when I wasn't in the room. About when we started trying. About how regular my cycle had been. About whether we had ever taken a break from each other during a rough patch the year before. None of it felt accusatory on the surface. It all sounded like concern, like curiosity, like a mother wanting to understand. But curiosity, when repeated often enough, becomes suspicion. Daniel didn't tell me at first. I only noticed that he started watching me more closely. Where had I been that afternoon? Why was I late coming home from work? Who was the male coworker whose name came up in conversation? I answered easily, because I had nothing to hide, and because the idea that my own husband could doubt me felt impossible. Meanwhile, Linda's behavior shifted in subtle ways. She stopped touching my stomach when she talked to the baby. She stopped referring to the pregnancy as our blessing and started saying, your situation. At family gatherings, I noticed conversations stopping when I entered the room. Smiles faded too quickly. Eye contact didn't last long enough. I told myself I was being hormonal. I told myself I was imagining things. The stress crept in quietly. I stopped sleeping through the night. My appetite disappeared. I began to dread family dinners. Each visit left me feeling smaller, like I was slowly being erased from a story that had already decided I was the villain. The rumors didn't explode all at once. They spread the way poison does, slow enough that no one notices until the damage is done. Linda began sharing her doubts with extended family, framing them as worries. She told people she was confused about the timing. She said she just wanted what was best for her son. She said she hoped the baby really was his, because she would be heartbroken otherwise. Every sentence ended with concern, but every word planted doubt. Daniel grew distant. He didn't touch my belly as often. He didn't talk to the baby anymore. When I cried, he looked overwhelmed instead of protective. I tried to talk to him, to explain how isolated I felt, how something was wrong, but he kept saying we were just under stress, and that his mother was only trying to help. I remember the first time I realized the rumors had reached beyond the family. Coworker asked me carefully if everything was okay at home. The way she said it made my chest tighten. When I asked what she meant, she hesitated and then said she'd heard things were complicated. I drove home shaking, my hands numb. On the steering wheel, understanding for the first time that whatever Linda had started was no longer contained. I begged Daniel to believe me. Not dramatically, not angrily, but desperately, quietly, in the way someone begs when they're afraid their world is slipping away. I reminded him of our life, our plans, our love. I reminded him that trust was the foundation of everything we had built. He didn't accuse me outright. That hurt even more. He said he was confused. He said he didn't know what to think. He said his mother had raised concerns he couldn't ignore. He said he just needed time. Time was something I didn't have. The stress began affecting my pregnancy. But how do you rest when your own family is quietly tearing you apart? How do you protect your child when the person meant to stand beside you is standing in silence? Linda never confronted me directly. She didn't need to. She had already done the damage. She watched me with calm detachment, as if my unraveling confirmed everything she wanted to believe. Sometimes she would offer me tea, or ask how I was feeling, her voice sweet, her eyes sharp. I learned then that cruelty doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience. By the end of my first trimester, I felt like I was carrying two unbearable weights at once. One was my baby. The other was the growing certainty that I was being judged, doubted, and condemned without ever being given the chance to defend myself. I had never cheated. Not once, not emotionally, not physically. My loyalty had never wavered. And yet, the lie had taken on a life of its own, stronger than truth, louder than reality. I didn't know then how far it would go. I didn't know what it would cost me. I didn't know that this was only the beginning of the worst period of my life. All I knew was that I was pregnant, scared and slowly being abandoned while everyone around me pretended it was concern. And that was just the start. By the time my second trimester began, the rumors no longer felt like whispers. They felt like walls closing in. What frightened me most wasn't that people were questioning me, but that the people closest to my life were beginning to treat suspicion as truth. I woke up every morning with a tightness in my chest, already exhausted before the day had even started, already bracing myself for whatever new doubt or quiet judgment would find its way into my hours. Daniel was changing in ways I didn't recognize. He still came home every night. He still asked if I'd eaten. He still touched my shoulder when he passed me in the hallway. But the warmth was gone. His presence felt cautious, like someone walking across thin ice, afraid that any wrong step might confirm something he didn't want to believe but was being trained to expect. I could feel the distance growing even when we sat on the same couch, even when we slept in the same bed. Linda, on the other hand, seemed energized. She became more involved than ever, calling Daniel daily, stopping by unexpectedly, offering help. That felt more like surveillance. She asked about my doctor appointments, my weight, my cravings, my moods. She framed everything as concern, as interest, as grandmotherly care. But every question carried an edge. Every observation felt recorded. I learned later that she was building a narrative piece by piece, turning normal pregnancy changes into supposed evidence of dishonesty. She told Daniel that stress could make women act unpredictably. She told him pregnancy hormones could cause guilt to surface. She told him she'd read stories about women who hid affairs until a baby forced the truth out. She never said my name when she said these things. She didn't have to. The implication hung heavy in every conversation. I tried to talk to Daniel again. I told him how alone I felt, how unsafe the environment had become, how the constant tension was affecting me physically. I told him that the baby needed peace, stability, protection. He listened, but his eyes drifted away from mine too often. He said he was just trying to understand everything. He said he was caught in the middle. He said his mother wouldn't lie to him. That sentence settled into my body like a weight. Caught in the middle meant he had already placed me on one side and doubt on the other. The isolation deepened. Family gatherings became unbearable. Conversations felt staged. I noticed people watching my stomach instead of my face, calculating, comparing, judging. Linda's sisters avoided sitting near me. Someone once joked about family traits and then laughed too loudly when I didn't join in. I started declining invitations, claiming fatigue, claiming doctor's orders, claiming anything that allowed me to stay home and breathe without feeling dissected. At work, the atmosphere shifted too. I sensed it in the way people spoke more carefully around me, in the glances that lingered just a second too long. I realized that rumors don't respect boundaries. Once released, they move freely, feeding on curiosity and moral judgment. I felt stripped of privacy, stripped of dignity, stripped of the simple right to exist without explanation. The stress began manifesting physically. I experienced frequent headaches, nausea that returned with a vengeance, sharp pains that sent me into panic. My doctor warned me again that emotional strain could have serious consequences. She asked if I had support at home. I lied and said yes, because admitting the truth felt too humiliating, too heavy to place in her hands. Linda started suggesting, very carefully, that perhaps a paternity test would bring everyone peace. She said it casually, as if she were talking about confirming a delivery date. She said it would protect Daniel. She said it would clear my name if I had nothing to hide. She never acknowledged how deeply insulting that suggestion was, how violent it felt to my sense of self, how cruel it was to propose such a thing while I was carrying a child whose every heartbeat depended on my emotional stability. Daniel didn't defend me when she said it. That silence did more damage than any accusation could have. I cried alone most nights, my hands pressed to my stomach, apologizing to the baby for the world they were being born into. I promised over and over that I would protect them, even if I couldn't protect myself. I promised that no matter what happened between the adults in their life, they would never doubt that they were wanted, loved, and innocent. Linda's control extended beyond words. She began interfering in decisions that had once belonged to Daniel and me. She questioned our choice of doctor. She criticized my diet. She suggested I wasn't responsible enough to handle pregnancy without supervision. Each comment chipped away at my confidence, not because I believed her, but because I could see how easily Daniel absorbed her doubts. One evening, I overheard Daniel on the phone with her. His voice was low, tense. He said he didn't know what to think anymore. He said things didn't add up. He said he just wanted the truth. I stood in the hallway, unseen, my heart breaking in a way I didn't know was possible. The truth was standing right there, listening, unheard. By this point, Linda no longer hid her disdain. Her kindness evaporated. Her looks grew cold. She stopped including me in conversations entirely. When she spoke about the baby, she referred to it vaguely, never calling it her grandchild. The distance she created was intentional, strategic. She was preparing herself, and everyone else, for the possibility that I would be discarded. I began to understand something devastating. This wasn't about protecting Daniel. It wasn't about family values. It wasn't even about the baby. It was about control. Linda could not stand the idea that something so important had happened without her authority, without her permission, without her ability to shape the narrative. My pregnancy was not a blessing to her. It was a threat. Daniel's confusion turned into withdrawal. He worked late. He avoided serious conversations. When I reached for him emotionally, he pulled away, saying he needed space to think. I watched my marriage unravel in slow motion, powerless to stop it, forced to endure every moment with my body already stretched thin by pregnancy. There were moments when I considered leaving, packing a bag and going somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. But I stayed because I believed, foolishly, that truth would eventually be enough. I believed that once the baby was born, once reality was undeniable, everything would fall back into place. I underestimated how destructive lies can be when they're nurtured daily by someone who knows exactly where to strike. Linda continued to see doubt wherever she could. She spoke to relatives, to church friends, to neighbors, always carefully, always with plausible deniability. She said she was worried. She said she hoped she was wrong. She said she was praying for clarity. Each word sharpened the blade she was holding to my reputation. Daniel didn't stop her. By the end of my second trimester, the loneliness felt unbearable. I was surrounded by people yet completely alone. My marriage felt like a courtroom where I was permanently on trial, and the verdict had already been decided in whispers. I started documenting everything, comments, dates, changes in behavior. I didn't know why at first. Something inside me just knew I might need proof someday. Not to convince them, but to remind myself that I wasn't imagining the slow destruction of my life. The baby kicked off and then, strong and insistent, a reminder that despite everything, life was continuing inside me. That tiny movement grounded me. It reminded me that no matter how cruel adults could be, innocence still existed. And I clung to that thought whenever the weight of suspicion threatened to crush me. I didn't know yet that the worst was still ahead. I didn't know how openly the accusations would soon surface, or how far Daniel would drift before he realized what had been done to us. All I knew was that the rumors were no longer whispers. They were becoming my reality. By the time my third trimester approached, the air inside my own home felt hostile. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was worse than that. It was quiet, heavy, and full of things that were never said out loud but were always present. Every movement I made felt watched. Every breath felt judged. Even moments that should have been intimate and sacred during pregnancy were overshadowed by doubt that had been planted so carefully it no longer needed nurturing. Daniel barely looked at my stomach anymore. The gentle gestures he once made, the way he used to talk to the baby, the way his hand would rest protectively against me, all of it faded. In its place was distance masked as thoughtfulness, silence disguised as confusion. I could feel him pulling away emotionally, even when his body was still physically present beside me. It felt like being abandoned slowly, one quiet moment at a time. Linda's presence became constant. She found reasons to stop by, reasons to call, reasons to insert herself into decisions that were never hers to make. She framed everything as concern, but her tone had shifted. There was less sweetness now, more certainty. She no longer spoke as someone asking questions. She spoke as someone who believed she already had the answers. She told Daniel that ignoring doubts would only make things worse later. She told him men often miss signs because they want to believe the best. She told him she would never forgive herself if she stayed silent and he was hurt. Every word she spoke was designed to make him feel foolish for trusting me, irresponsible for loving me, weak for not demanding proof. I felt myself shrinking inside my own marriage, the first time Daniel truly questioned me. It didn't happen as a confrontation. It happened as disappointment. He asked me if there was anything I wanted to tell him. Not accusingly, not angrily, but with a tired resignation that broke something inside my chest. I told him there was nothing to tell because I had done nothing wrong. I reminded him that we had built our life on honesty. I reminded him that trust was supposed to be non-negotiable. He listened, but he didn't look relieved. That was the moment I realized belief was no longer automatic. From then on, everything I did felt like it required justification. If I was emotional, it was hormones. If I was calm, it was guilt. If I defended myself, I was being defensive. If I stayed quiet, I was hiding something. There was no version of me that could exist without being interpreted through suspicion. Linda escalated her behavior. She began openly suggesting that the baby might not resemble Daniel. She talked about genetics constantly. She mentioned blood types. She brought up timelines again and again, insisting that something didn't add up. Each conversation chipped away at Daniel's confidence in his own judgment, replacing it with hers. What hurt most was not the accusation itself. It was the way Daniel allowed it to live between us without challenging it. He never stood up and said enough. He never drew a line. His silence became permission. The emotional stress began to take a physical toll. I struggled to sleep. I woke up shaking. My appetite vanished. My doctor warned me again, more firmly this time, that my blood pressure was rising dangerously. She asked if something traumatic was happening at home. I couldn't bring myself to explain how betrayal doesn't always look violent, how sometimes it looks like quiet doubt that eats you alive from the inside. Linda suggested that a paternity test would solve everything. She presented it as the reasonable solution, the mature choice, the way forward. She framed it as something that would protect Daniel and clear my name at the same time. She never acknowledged how deeply humiliating it was to ask a pregnant woman to prove her fidelity like a criminal. Daniel didn't reject the idea. He said he didn't want to hurt me. He said he just needed reassurance. He said if there was nothing to hide, then it shouldn't matter. Those words cut deeper than anything Linda had said, because they came from the man who was supposed to know my heart better than anyone. I realized then that the marriage I thought I had was already gone. I began emotionally detaching, not because I wanted to, but because surviving required it. I focused on the baby. I poured everything I had left into protecting that small life growing inside me. I spoke softly to my stomach at night, telling my child they were loved beyond measure, that none of this was their fault, that I would never allow anyone to make them feel unwanted. Linda's behavior became openly hostile. She stopped pretending to care how I felt. She talked about me as if I weren't there. She told relatives she was preparing herself emotionally for disappointment. She spoke about me as a problem that needed resolution rather than a person carrying her grandchild. Daniel withdrew further. He spent more time at work, more time at his parents' house, more time away from me. When he was home, he seemed distracted, burdened, overwhelmed by the pressure Linda had placed on him. I watched him slowly align himself with her perspective. Not because he was cruel, but because it was easier than standing alone. The humiliation was unbearable. I felt stripped of dignity. My loyalty was questioned. My character was dissected. My pregnancy, once a source of joy, became evidence in a case I never agreed to participate in. I began to fear what would happen after the baby was born. Would they treat my child as an outsider? Would Daniel always look at them with doubt in his eyes? Would Linda poison that relationship too, whispering suspicion into every milestone? The thought terrified me. There were moments when I almost begged Daniel to leave, just to end the agony of waiting for him to choose. But I stayed silent because I didn't want to be accused of running away. I didn't want to give them another reason to frame me as guilty. The accusations became unavoidable. Daniel told me that his mother was insisting we prepare for all possibilities. He said she wanted legal clarity. He said she believed it was irresponsible not to question things now rather than later. Hearing that shattered whatever hope I still had that this nightmare would resolve quietly. I felt abandoned while still married. Linda had succeeded in turning doubt into a permanent presence. She didn't need proof. She didn't need truth. She only needed repetition. And repetition, when backed by authority and emotional pressure, becomes belief. By the end of this phase, I no longer recognized myself. I was anxious, exhausted, emotionally. I had lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. I avoided mirrors because I didn't recognize the woman staring back. The pregnancy glow people talk about was replaced by constant fear and heartbreak. And yet, through it all, the baby continued to grow, strong and insistent, as if reminding me that life does not pause for cruelty. I didn't know then that the next stage would push me to a breaking point I hadn't yet imagined. I didn't know how openly I would be abandoned, or how deeply the betrayal would cut once the accusations moved from implication to action. All I knew was that trust had been poisoned, and the damage was no longer reversible. By the time my third trimester fully settled in, I no longer felt like a wife. I felt like a liability everyone was quietly preparing to remove. The house I lived in didn't feel like home anymore. Every room carried tension, every corner felt heavy with unspoken judgment, and every day stretched longer than the one before it. I woke up exhausted and went to bed emotionally empty, counting hours instead of moments, wondering how something that was supposed to be the most protected time of my life had turned into a slow public unraveling. Daniel stopped asking about my appointments altogether. He didn't accompany me anymore. He didn't ask how the baby was doing. When I mentioned kicks or milestones, he nodded absently, as if the pregnancy were something happening in the background of his life, rather than something we had created together. That absence hurt more than anger ever could. It told me that, in his mind, the baby was no longer unquestionably his, and I was no longer unquestionably his wife. Linda no longer bothered pretending. Her concern had hardened into certainty. She spoke with confidence now, not speculation. She treated me like someone who had already been exposed, like someone simply waiting for consequences to arrive. She told extended family members that she was bracing herself for heartbreak. She told them she was worried about Daniel's emotional health. She told them she was doing everything she could to protect her son. No one asked me what I needed. I noticed how people started speaking around me instead of to me. Conversations happened in lowered voices. Decisions were made without my input. I became a presence rather than a participant, a figure people tiptoed around while quietly assuming the worst. Even Robert, who had always been distant but neutral, avoided eye contact. Melissa stopped responding to my messages altogether. The isolation was suffocating. The stress pushed my body past its limits. I experienced dizzy spells, chest tightness, moments where my vision blurred and my heart raced uncontrollably. My doctor warned me that the pregnancy was becoming high risk. She emphasized the importance of emotional stability, of support, of rest. I nodded and thanked her, knowing none of those things existed in my reality anymore. Linda suggested, through Daniel, that perhaps it would be best if I spent some time away. She framed it as concern for my health. What she really meant was that my presence made it harder to maintain the narrative she had built. I was inconvenient. I was a reminder that I was still there, still pregnant, still real. Daniel didn't defend me. He told me that maybe some distance would help. He said emotions were running too high. He said he needed clarity. Hearing that broke something final inside me. It told me that when forced to choose between protecting me and appeasing his mother, he had already made his decision. I packed a small bag and left the house we had shared, the house where we had dreamed about raising our child. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was for peace. But deep down, I knew it was abandonment disguised as practicality. I stayed with a friend who tried to be supportive, but didn't know how to hold the weight of what I was carrying emotionally. I spent long days alone, staring at walls, feeling the baby move, trying to ground myself in the one truth that hadn't been corrupted. That baby was mine. That baby was innocent. That baby was real. Linda used my absence as confirmation. She told people I had left because I was hiding something. She told Daniel that innocent people don't run. She told him my behavior matched patterns she had read about. Every action I took, even those meant to protect myself, was twisted into further proof against me. Daniel began limiting contact. He said he needed space to think. He said conversations were too emotional. He said everything felt overwhelming. Preparing for a life that no longer included me as his wife, the humiliation became public. Family friends stopped reaching out. Invitations disappeared. Support vanished. Carefully positioning herself as the protective mother navigating a painful situation. She didn't need to. I was no longer Emily the wife, Emily the soon-to-be mother. I was Emily the problem, Emily the question mark, Emily the rumor. There were moments when I felt myself breaking apart entirely. I cried until my body shook. I held my stomach and begged the baby to forgive the world they were being born into. If trusting his family had been naive beyond repair. But even in my weakest moments, one thing remained clear. I had done nothing wrong. Linda's cruelty escalated when she realized I was no longer present to defend myself. She pushed Daniel toward legal conversations, toward preparations, toward emotional detachment. She spoke as if the outcome were already decided. Daniel allowed it. By the time I entered the final weeks of pregnancy, I was effectively alone. My reputation was destroyed. And yet, I still woke up every morning, still ate when I could, still attended appointments, began preparing for motherhood without Daniel in my plans. I strengthened friendships outside his family. Slowly, painfully, I accepted that even if the truth came out someday, the damage done to my marriage might never fully heal. Linda never reached out to ask how I was doing. She never asked about the baby's health. She never expressed concern for the stress she had created. In her mind, I was already guilty, and guilt does not deserve compassion. Daniel visited once during this time. His presence felt foreign, like someone from a life I used to live. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was scared, exhausted, and hurt beyond words. He listened but offered no reassurance, no protection, no apology. That was when I understood fully that I could not rely on him anymore. The baby arrived closer every day. I stopped waiting for belief. I stopped waiting for fairness. Collapse. All I knew was that I had been abandoned during the most vulnerable time of my life. Not by strangers, but by the people who were supposed to be my family. And that realization changed me forever. Labor didn't begin the way it does in stories. There was no dramatic rush, no urgent phone calls, no comforting presence beside me. It started quietly, almost apologetically, like my body didn't want to bother anyone. I knew immediately what it was. Somewhere deep inside me I already understood that if I reached for him in that moment and he hesitated, even for a second, it would break me in a way I wouldn't recover from. I needed presence, not obligation. So I called the friend who had been quietly standing by me through everything. The one person who never questioned my integrity. The car, and drove me to the hospital while I focused on breathing through each wave of pain, grounding myself in the rhythm of it. The hospital room was sterile and bright and impersonal, but I welcomed that. I was just another woman about to give birth. The contractions intensified quickly. Hours blurred together. Nurses came and went. I hesitated, then nodded. Not because I wanted him there. Speculation and doubt. No rumor could prepare him for the sight of me like that, vulnerable, exhausted, powerful in a way that no accusation could touch. Linda did not come. Something inside me realigned. The pain faded into the background, replaced by an overwhelming clarity. This tiny human, warm and breathing, looking up at me with unfocused eyes, was mine. Not as property, not as proof, but as purpose. Daniel stood nearby, silent. Look at him. He hesitated. That hesitation said more than words ever could. The moment passed. The cord was cut without ceremony. The baby was cleaned, examined, wrapped, and returned to me. A hospital administrator explained the standard paperwork. About the paternity test. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in my expression must have unsettled. I didn't defend myself. I simply said yes. The test was arranged before I was even discharged. I welcomed it. I had been waiting for this moment since the first seed of doubt was planted. Fear. She didn't come to the hospital, but she called Daniel repeatedly. She asked questions framed as concern. She reminded him to protect himself. She reminded him of everything she had noticed. She reminded him of how hurt he would be if he ignored red flags. I didn't hear these conversations directly. I didn't need to. Daniel carried them into the room with him, heavy and unresolved, like emotional residue clinging to his clothes. The test results came back faster than anyone expected. One moment. A nurse was handing Daniel an envelope. His hands were shaking. I watched his face change as he read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something deeper, shame, realization, and a kind of grief that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with regret. The baby was his. Without question, without ambiguity. He covered his face with his hands. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was broken. She had questioned the test, asked about accuracy, suggested repeat testing. When that failed, she shifted tactics. She said she had only ever been trying to protect him. She said stress makes people act irrationally. She never apologized. She never acknowledged the harm she had caused. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. The truth alone does not undo damage. It only exposes it. Daniel apologized to me repeatedly. He cried. He said he should have believed me. I accepted his apology as acknowledgement. The abandonment had already happened. The days after the birth were some of the loneliest of my life. Even with the baby in my arms, even with nurses around, even with Daniel present more often, I felt the absence of something fundamental. Trust does not return on command. Safety does not rebuild overnight. Linda finally visited once. She stood at the foot of the bed, looked at the baby, and commented on the resemblance to Daniel. Her tone was neutral, polite, controlled. I understood that while one chapter had closed, another was only beginning. The truth had come out, but the consequences were still unfolding. My relationship with Linda was beyond repair. This child would never feel the kind of abandonment I had endured. Because love, real love, does not waver when it is tested. By the time the truth fully settled into my bones, I realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. I had already survived the worst part. The rumors, the accusations, the looks that stripped me of dignity while I was carrying life. Inside me, those things had already tried to kill me, and they had failed. What remained was the aftermath, and aftermaths are quieter, lonelier, and somehow heavier. The house I lived in no longer felt like a battleground, but it didn't feel like a home either. It felt like a place where echoes lived. Echoes of conversations I was never allowed to finish. Echoes of judgments made behind closed doors. Echoes of a pregnancy that had been treated like a crime instead of a miracle. My body changed every day. My stomach growing heavier, my back aching, my breath shortening, and with each change, I felt more disconnected from the people who should have been standing beside me. There were no hands on my belly anymore. No curiosity about names or future plans. Only distance, wrapped in politeness, sharpened by suspicion. Even after the medical proof, even after the timeline made sense, even after facts replaced gossip, something had permanently broken. Trust doesn't snap loudly. It erodes, and once it's gone, no apology can bring it back the same way. What hurt most wasn't the rumors themselves, it was how easily they were believed. How quickly I was reduced from a wife to a liar, from a pregnant woman to a question mark. I replayed it endlessly in my mind. The moment everything shifted. One whisper. One planted doubt. And suddenly, years of loyalty meant nothing compared to someone else's certainty. I learned then that truth doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it waits quietly while lies are celebrated. I stopped trying to explain myself. Not because I was guilty, but because I was exhausted. Pregnancy is supposed to be a time when you're protected, when your vulnerability is honored. Instead, I had learned to sleep with my hands wrapped around my stomach, as if I could shield my child from emotional harm. I spoke softly, walked carefully, existed cautiously. Stress became my shadow. Silence became my armor. The moment I decided to leave wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no final argument. It was a quiet morning. I was sitting alone, sunlight touching the floor, and I realized I could not raise a child in a place where love was conditional, where respect disappeared the moment someone else told a convincing lie. I understood then that staying would teach my child the wrong lesson, that endurance was the same as acceptance, that survival meant silence. I didn't want that legacy. Leaving while pregnant feels like jumping without knowing where you'll land. I packed slowly. Every item felt symbolic. Clothes folded with shaking hands. Baby items packed with both hope and grief. I didn't take much, I didn't need much. What I needed wasn't material. It was peace. The door closing behind me didn't sound loud, but inside me, something final settled. I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself. Life after leaving was not instantly better. It was harder in practical ways. Money was tight. Nights were long. Fear visited often. But something inside me began to heal. I could breathe without being watched. Cry without being judged. Rest without bracing for the next accusation. One rebuilt. Slowly, one routine at a time. Doctor visits alone. Grocery shopping alone. Preparing for birth alone. And yet, I was never truly alone because I carried purpose with me everywhere. When my child was born, the room was quiet and sacred. No rumors followed us there. No whispers crossed the threshold. Only life, real and undeniable. In that moment, everything that had tried to break me lost its power. I looked at my child and understood something with absolute clarity. Nothing that happened before could define us now. Lies had shaped the past, but truth would shape the future. The apologies came later. Carefully worded, emotionally distant, too late to matter. Accountability was partial, regret selective. I listened, not because I needed closure from them, but because I had already found it within myself. Forgiveness, I learned, does not require reconciliation. You can forgive someone and still refuse to let them back into your life. Boundaries. are not cruelty. They are survival. Today, my life is quieter, stronger, built on truth instead of appearances. My child will grow up knowing that their existence was never a scandal, it was a victory. A reminder that even when the world doubts you, even when family turns against you, even when your integrity is questioned at your most vulnerable moment, you can still rise. You can still choose dignity. You can still create a future untouched by the poison of the past. What they tried to destroy became the reason I found myself. What they called shame became my strength. And what they whispered behind my back became a story I now tell without fear. Because it no longer controls me. I survived the rumors. I protected my child. And I walked away with my truth intact. CTA. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps real stories of survival reach the people who feel alone and reminds them they're not.